Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to George Croft's American Music Show. Today, we are diving into the life and career of Jerry Lee Lewis, so stick around. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's that time of year again. August 22nd, 3rd, and 4th, we are doing the second annual Kennedy Meadows Music Festival up at Kennedy Meadows here. And tickets are available at KennedyMeadowsMusicFest.com, and at checkout, use code GeorgeCroftKM, capital G, capital C. And get you some tickets here. It's great. So I think the cabins are sold out, but there's still room for trailer spaces. There's first come, first served tent camping. The lineup this year for Kennedy's is going to be awesome. We've got Dallas Burrow is coming back, Chad Bushnell's coming back, Dave Stamey's coming back, Trinity Seeley's coming back, Ben Haggard is headlining. And so it's going to be just an awesome show. I can't tell you how excited I am. I'll be there all weekend long. I'll be emceeing the whole thing and playing on Saturday. So come on out and see us here. So get your tickets while you can. All right, but first I've got some dates coming up, so come on out and see me. We'll be into August 1st. I'll be at Diamond Jim's in Meewook. And then August 2nd, I'll be at the Sonora Tap Room in downtown Sonora. August 10th, I'll be at Gaslight Co. in downtown Folsom. August 14th, I'll be at Tano's in Orangevale. And then we've got the Kennedy Meadows Music Festival the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th of August. So come on out and see me. We are also brought to you by Tyler & Co. Marketing, providing top-notch photography and videography services to Northern California. Tyler & Co. is your one-stop shop for social media content, product videos, commercials, promotional videos, and best of all, weddings and events. I dare you to take a quick scroll down their Instagram page at TylerandCo_marketing and tell me it doesn't look like a Hollywood production. If you want people to ask you who the executive producer of your wedding was, call Tyler & Co. If you want it to look like you got paid just to be in your wedding photos, call Tyler & Co. If you want the video of your first dance to look like it qualified you for the Screen Actors Guild, call Tyler & Co. And best of all, your future father-in-law is going to forgive you for everything, when he finds out how much money you're saving him on this wedding by using Tyler & Co. Marketing to capture your big day. So visit TylerandCoFilms.com for all your photography needs. That's TylerandCoFilms.com. Ladies and gentlemen, I have some big news coming up here. So I have started an Indiegogo campaign to produce and launch my next single called To Be Enough. And I'm very passionate about this project. It's one of my favorite songs I've ever written. And I'm going to give it 100% effort here to get this thing professionally done, released, and promoted across all the different social media platforms and everything else. Kind of put all my eggs in this basket for now and see how far I can take it. But for that to work, I need public support. And that can be found on my Indiegogo page, which can be found on my link tree, which is through either my TikTok or Instagram account. If you go to my links, my Indiegogo campaign is the top one. And I would love and appreciate any support that you guys feel like giving. And we're going to try to make a real go of this thing. So please, if you don't mind, check that out. And hopefully I'll see you soon. All right, so Jerry Lee Lewis is somebody who I, after kind of digging in and doing some research, is kind of a conflicting guy to have in the Rolodex of our music history icons here, because I mean he was conflicted in himself. He was simultaneously very religious, but also had some, kind of did some light crime when he was younger, and he had all kinds of moral quandaries we're going to get into. But and he was always, in conversation with other people, it was very clear he's a very religious guy, but he was always kind of falling short of the mark, as do we all. But anyway, so Jerry Lee is born in 1935, in September of 1935. And it's pretty clear early on that he's very musically gifted. And when he's 9 years old, by the time he's 9 years old, he's performing on stage in front of like the church that his parents are going to. So he's playing the piano in church. And he mostly learned how to play piano just by ear, just by hearing his mom play and hearing the people in the church play. And so he picks it up by ear. Eventually, his parents tried to put him in actual like structured piano lessons, but it didn't last very long. It lasted, I think he made it like 2 or 3 lessons or something. By the time, he just couldn't hang with a structure like that. The guy's trying to teach him, note by note, key by key, how to play the piano. And every 2 seconds, Jerry Lee's just breaking out into playing, some like ragtime fun stuff. And so it caused some issues with that instructor, and it, like I said, didn't last very long. That did not stop his parents from mortgaging their house to buy a piano, which was a mistake. I mean, it's great for Jerry Lee. He learned to play the piano, and and that shot him off, into stardom later. But their parents did lose their house over that piano deal. Like they mortgaged the house to buy the piano and then lost it. So, that didn't work out super great. But anyway, so he, goes through his childhood, pretty standard, childhood in the South, going to church, playing music, relatively uneventful here. But then when he gets into his teenage years, when he's 16 years old, he gets married. And he gets married to a girl who's a preacher's daughter. And and by this time, he's already got a reputation. He's already like the fun, rockabilly, piano playing kid. Like, that's Jerry Lee Lewis. And, he leans into that pretty hard, but he meets this, girl, and they're married very quickly. And her parents are not having it. Like, from the jump, nobody's happy about this. Because she's 16, or I think they're both 16 at the time, or she might have been 15, but Jerry Lee was 16. And it's kind of the way that he sold it to her dad was like, oh, I'm going to go to seminary and become a preacher. Like, that's what I'm going to do. And so that kind of worked. Like, that there was, some pressure taken off for a minute. But Jerry Lee gets kicked out of seminary for playing like rockabilly music on the piano. Like, he quickly flunks out of that deal. And that, and so his wife's dad just yanks the plug and says, nope, you guys aren't, staying married. They separate, and that marriage ended in divorce after like less than 2 years. It was like 20 months or something, that first marriage ends. So Jerry Lee finds himself, he's not even 20 yet, and he's been married and divorced. And then, let's see here, I'm jumping ahead a little bit here. So that was 1952. And he'd also, like, let's see, he gets married again. So 1953, he gets married again. So that's, he gets married to a lady named Jane Mitchum. And they have 2 kids pretty quick, like right off the bat. That's 1954 and 1956. There was a phase here before he moves to Memphis where he's working like every odd job he can get his hands on. One of them is being a vacuum cleaner salesman. So this is where he gets into some like actual crimes here, because what he starts doing is going house to house, telling housewives, hey, you won a vacuum cleaner. And then if you just sign here and pay the $10 for the taxes and fees, here's a vacuum cleaner. So these housewives are all happy. Oh, great. They sign the paper, take their vacuum cleaner. Well, the paper they signed was actually just a contract for like a payment plan. So then they're getting bills for their vacuum cleaner in the mail. Well, Jerry Lee is like, oh, he's the top salesman in the state because he's just going all down the street giving away vacuum cleaners and then just billing all these housewives for the months afterwards. So anyway, so he ends up getting, he's charged with a crime, but he somehow pretty much gets off the hook for this deal. Like the DA wanted him, like he says, the DA wanted me, bad for that deal. And it's like, well, yeah, because you defrauded, dozens, if not hundreds of housewives. And anyway, so that kind of sours his position in that town. So this is where he makes the move to Memphis. And that marriage kind of falls apart during this time also, like for obvious reasons. And so Jerry Lee moves to Memphis, and I think that was in 1956, I think. Yeah. So 1956, he moves to Memphis. He gets divorced shortly after this. And but this is where he ends up at Sun Records. Now, Sun Records in 1956 is a pretty happening place because Elvis had gotten there, I think, in 1953, just a few years before. And Sun Records plucked Elvis out of obscurity. Like that was, and basically Elvis had walked in. If I'm correct, it's 1953. He just walked into Sun Records and paid for studio time because he said he was making a record as a gift for his mom. And over the course of a year, he comes in a couple more times before Sam Phillips, who's the owner of Sun Records, before Sam Phillips signs Elvis. Elvis had come in twice over the course of 6 months and paid for studio time. And then obviously Elvis's story takes off, and he's, there's a lot of history there. But this is that initial kind of window of a couple of years here. So Elvis gets there in 1953. His career takes off, and he actually leaves Sun Records in 1956. So keep that in your hat. So Elvis leaves Sun Records in 1956, even though him and Sam Phillips remained friends. Basically, what had happened is Sam Phillips had kind of found himself in a bunch of financial trouble, and he was able to sell Elvis's contract to, I think it was RCA, for like $40,000 or $35,000 or something. And that was enough money to solve the rest of his problems with all his other artists at this kind of growing record label that he had going. Artists like Johnny Cash, who walked in the door in 1955. And Johnny Cash, which we talked about Johnny Cash's story. Johnny Cash got rejected by Sam Phillips over and over and over and over and over again over the course of a few months. He would just call him on the phone, and because Johnny Cash wanted to do gospel music, and Sam Phillips said that he couldn't sell gospel records, so he wasn't gonna engage with Johnny Cash. But Johnny Cash was just persistent, and then one day just shows up on the door of Sun Records, shows up on their doorstep, and he just decides he's going to play until they kick him out. Well, by the end of that deal, Sam Phillips lets him in, lets him, sing some of his other songs, and that's how Johnny Cash ends up getting signed. So that was in, I think, 1955. So Elvis comes in 54, Johnny Cash comes in 55, Elvis leaves in 1956, but they're still on good terms, right? So there wasn't any bad blood between Elvis and Sam Phillips. They're still friends. Elvis is just over at RCA now. Then, 1956, Jerry Lee Lewis shows up in Memphis after, defrauding all the housewives for their vacuum cleaners, and does something similar to Johnny Cash, where he just shows up at the door, but he gets let in pretty quick here and he's initially hired as a studio musician just because he's so talented at the piano. He's very clearly the caliber of player they wanted. They let Jerry Lee in pretty quick. So that sets the stage for later in 1956. It was December 4th, I think, in 1956. All of these dudes, and Carl Perkins, who's another Sun Records artist. Carl Perkins had signed up for studio time. They were meeting to record for Carl Perkins. And I think Jerry Lee was supposed to just be the piano player for the Carl Perkins record they were working on. So that's Carl Perkins is in the room, Jerry Lee is in the room. Then Johnny Cash walks in, just because he's around. Then Elvis Presley walks in the room because he was just in town visiting Sam Phillips, because they're still friends. He just came by he had his girlfriend with him, and he just swung by to say hello. Next thing you know, these four guys are in a room just jamming, playing gospel songs and everything else, whatever they wanted. And mostly what you hear when you go back and listen, that record has become known as the $1 Million Quartet. It was released later. I think it was released in the 80s, I think. But this recording is made in 1967 or whatever I said. And but that happening, that recording is basically, and these guys are all young at the time. I think Elvis is 24, Johnny Cash is 22 or something. I think Jerry Lee's 21. They're all in their early 20s. And they just happened to all land in the same room with the tape rolling. And But mostly when you listen back to it, it's mostly Jerry Lee Lewis on the piano and Elvis singing. Like Elvis kind of steamrolls everybody about what songs they're doing. And, oh yeah, start this one. And then like they kind of all start singing together, but then Elvis is just overpowering everybody. So it's mostly Elvis and Jerry Lee that you hear. But still, they're all in the room and it's this cool like historic moment. And that's also where Jerry Lee starts to get a little bit more traction because he's, you know, his talent is being recognized by other artists in that space. And he has a song come out soon thereafter, I think called Whole Lot of Shakin' Going On. And that was 1957. Okay, so the $1 Million Quartet is December of 56. And then A Whole Lot of Shakin' Going On comes out in 1957. And that launches Jerry Lee Lewis into stardom because he was this crazy, like, full energy, jumping around, kicking his piano stool out from behind him, playing standing up, and just like he was a top-notch showman from the jump. And he was doing everything that Elvis was doing, but at least in some of those early shows, you could make the argument that Jerry Lee Lewis's show was more high energy than Elvis's show. And I mean, it happens throughout his entire career, but this like just hilarious footage of people in the crowd, just like they don't know what's happening to their bodies and they're just like screaming and getting excited and dancing and jumping around and girls are hucking stuff on the stage. There's one set of footage where Jerry Lee is just banging away on the piano. His blonde hair is like whipping everywhere and a chair just goes flying across the screen. Like somebody just got overexcited and hucked a chair across the room for no reason. Like Morgan Wallen was at a Jerry Lee Lewis concert. And so that's how it starts off. And that first year is like full stardom. I think at one point he was making like $10,000 per show. And so Jerry Lee is, you know, enjoying the fruits of success, a bit of a boost to his ego. And this is where he makes a serious moral, career, tactical error. Like this is where his troubles really begin. Because in December of 1957, Jerry Lee Lewis walks into his cousin's house, sees his cousin's 13-year-old daughter, and is immediately infatuated with this kid. And they get married soon thereafter, to the objection of her, you know, dad, his cousin, and even Jerry Lee's mom. So Jerry Lee's mom and him were very tight, and that was like he had a like very intense emotional connection to his mom. She kind of like the same way that Hank Williams was with his mom, where she was like involved in the business end and like kind of one of his main champions. And she was telling him, do not do this. Like this is against God and everything else. Like do not like get involved with your cousin who's 13. But Jerry Lee was sold, and that's what he was doing. So, and keep in mind at this point, his divorce from wife number 2 was not even finalized yet at this point. Like the paperwork is still getting drug on from this deal. So, and this is where we get a little bit of, it's interesting to go back and watch interviews because the people that benefited from Jerry Lee, like if you were on Jerry Lee's payroll, for the most part, those people in interviews are like, well, it was a different time back then. And, you know, Jerry Lee's sister got married when she was 12, which is true and equally crazy, but that happened. And so, the few people that are around him that really had a reason to keep their mouth shut at the time, to this day will say, oh, it was just a different time and blah, 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 blah. No, like that seems to be just that pocket of people because it wasn't that different of a time because this sinks his career. He was kind of like the R. Kelly of his time where everybody is very upset by this. And it really, you know, things hit the fan in, I think, later in 1957 or 58, maybe early 1958, Jerry Lee Lewis gets sent on a tour to Europe. And he's told by record label people, do not bring your wife, which already is kind of alarming. It's like, you're telling me the record label people, they were concerned about it enough to tell him to hide this, right? So people knew this is weird and messed up. But anyway, they're going to keep trucking along. And they told Jerry Lee, leave your wife at home. And he said, no, you don't tell me what to do. I'm going to, and to be fair to Jerry Lee Lewis, he does not seem to have registered at all that this is a problem. He's like, kind of defiantly, even later in interviews later in his life, he's like, oh, they just had it out for me because rock and roll was on the outs. And, like it was like he felt unfairly persecuted for marrying his 13-year-old cousin, which is kind of wild. But he maintains that belief that he was just like, they just had it out for me for no reason, despite how normal it was at the time. Which is a wild thing to say into the 90s. What's funny, there was an interview I saw where I think his cousin, a different cousin, a guy named Cecil, who like everybody in the South has a cousin named Cecil, and Cecil's in this interview like, well, it was just a different time, and I think I think they were real hard on Jerry, and if it had been a different time like the 90s, I think they would have been a little more forgiving. So for whatever reason, both arguments get posed, that like it was a different time back then, or it would have been more acceptable in the 90s, which I don't understand how he came to that conclusion at all. Like that, maybe the 90s were way more wild than I remember, but that dude seemed to think that Jerry Lee would have caught less guff for marrying his 13-year-old cousin if he'd have done it in the 90s. I don't think that's correct, but that's what Cousin Cecil said. So, the European tour is the moment of collapse because Jerry Lee lands in England and the English press are all over him, and they immediately, because Jerry Lee, I think his sister was there with him also, and his sister is, like much older than his wife, obviously, and so you've got like two adults and a kid getting off a plane, and the media is like, so who are you, and how does this work? And like, so, okay, they establish this one's Jerry's sister, and then they kind of go to the kid, and they're like, and who are you? And she kind of just kind of mumbles, and kind of like kicks Jerry to kind of get him to say something to distract their attention. He tries. And then the guy's like, okay, yeah, sure. But I'm sorry, who are you again? And like gets back to the kid. She goes, I'm Jerry's wife. Pin drop. Everybody knows, oh, this is the story now. Like this is where we're going. So they proceed. The headlines for the days after starts off, Jerry Lee Lewis arrives in England with his child bride of 15. That was day 1. Day 2, correction, Jerry Lee Lewis arrives in UK with his child bride of 13. Day 3, correction, Jerry Lee Lewis arrives in UK with his child bride of 13, his second cousin. Day 4 was Jerry Lee Lewis arrives in England with his child bride of 13, his second cousin, while still being married to somebody else. So it was a bigamous relationship, which that seems to be the nail. That, for whatever reason, the bigamy part was what really puts the nail in the coffin for Jerry Lee. He's kicked out of your... Now, he says later he was not kicked out of England. He just chose to leave. Other people were like, they kicked him out. Like that, he was told in no uncertain terms to get out of England. He maintains that he wasn't, because he does go back later. But, he makes it sound like, oh, I was just, they were picking on my wife, so I left. Like he's got some moral high ground to use here. So he comes back to the U.S., kind of tail tucked here, cancels the rest of the European tour. I think he said when he left, he ended up owing promoters and stuff like $300,000 or something. So he leaves the tour very far in the hole. But so he gets back to the U.S., and it's kind of a repeat where the American press now are onto him. And they aren't quite as tenacious as the British press at the time, because there's an interview that you can still go see of Jerry Lee Lewis with his wife, which is a crazy statement to say when you see the footage. I mean, it's Jerry Lee and a kid. And they're asking him like, so how'd the European tour? How was the reception in Europe? And Jerry's like, oh, it was fine. It was a nice reception. We were, everybody was nice. And the guy was like, no, nothing exciting going on over there. Like, he obviously knew, and he's trying to like dig it out of Jerry Lee. And Jerry Lee is just like, no, we just, we had to cancel the tour. We, decided for personal reasons, blah, 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 blah. And so, and then the reporter kind of points the mic at Jerry Lee's wife, Myra, and is like, how'd you like the European tour? And she's kind of like, oh, well, I didn't go to the shows, but I was there, And then he kind of drops the act and he goes, so when did you guys get married? And that's when Jerry Lee ends the interview. He's like, yeah, we're not doing personal questions, and kind of just, gives the guy a look. And the guy kind of takes the hint. He's like, all right, well, have a good show. And then the interview's over. But everybody knew. The American press picks it up and runs with it too. Jerry Lee's reputation is completely trashed, and rightfully so. So he proceeds to go from making like $10,000 a night to like $200 a night playing bars and honky tonks and stuff. But he seems to have taken that in relative stride. I mean, that doesn't seem to have bothered him that much. Now, obviously, he can't maintain that forever, but it was like 10 years of career blackout for Jerry Lee Lewis. Because now, and you can imagine too, like the market at the time, this is still prime Elvis Presley going on in the US. So why do we have to cut any slack to Jerry Lee Lewis? And like, you got an option. You can go buy tickets to go see Elvis, or you can go buy tickets to go see Jerry Lee, the guy that married his 13-year-old cousin. Where are you putting your money? And so Elvis does great during this time, and Jerry Lee falls into obscurity, and fair enough. And so, but they still kind of know each other. Like Elvis and Jerry Lee are still, friends. And so in 1963 here, like just after, or no, it was just before he had actually, he had signed a different record deal before he went on tour there. So in 1963, he moved to Smash Records. 64, his marriage to Myra gets becomes official, I guess, after his divorce gets finalized. Anyway, but this is, in this string of years here, in kind of the dark shadow of his reputation, where he's playing these cheap gigs and everything. And he's still making records, but nobody's buying them. Like, record labels are still having him work, but his sales are through the floor. And this is where you get some kind of crazy stories, because Jerry Lee gets heavy into the drugs and alcohol at this point, where, I mean, as everybody was doing, this is the 60s in the music business. As we've discussed ad nauseum on this show, everybody's on pills, everybody's doing coke, everybody's drunk off their wheels, it's a full party all the time. And so this is where you get these crazy stories, one of which involves Jerry Lee Lewis shoots his bass player in the chest with a .357 Magnum. Accidentally, but still shoots the guy. So basically, like, it was called an accident, and Jerry Lee's like, oh yeah, I didn't know the gun was loaded, and I was just target practicing at a Coke bottle in his office, which is like, okay. Like, okay. However it happened, bullet leaves the gun, misses the Coke bottle, but manages to strike the bass player in the chest. So, I don't know how that happens, and it's an accident, I guess. So that guy lives. The bass player survives this deal, which, lucky him, but he's in the hospital for like more than a month. He's completely bedridden, useless. He ends up suing Jerry Lee Lewis for damages and wins like $175,000 or something. Like he does get some money out of Jerry Lee for shooting him in the chest, which, fair enough. And Jerry Lee he had an affinity for guns anyway. Like, he was kind of a gun guy. But he's all, you mix that with booze, pills, and, cocaine, and that's not a great combo. So at one point soon after, Jerry Lee, I think this was after that happened. I might have these two events mixed up in the timeline. But Jerry Lee gets a call. So, okay, there's two versions of the story. Jerry Lee's version of the story is he had been given a pistol by somebody else, and that person had told him, leave it on the dashboard of your car so it's not considered a concealed weapon, which maybe that was sound advice at the time, I guess. I don't know. For whatever reason, Jerry Lee's riding around with a gun on the dashboard of his car. Then it falls onto the floorboard of his car, and he says he just didn't notice, and there's just a gun on the floorboard now. Then, keep that in mind, so there's a gun on the floorboard of Jerry Lee's car. Jerry Lee says he receives a phone call from Elvis Presley asking him to come down to Graceland because he was depressed about something. And even Jerry Lee acknowledges that that statement is weird because he says, I don't know what Elvis had to be depressed about, but that's what he said. So I drove down there. Jerry Lee gets pulled over. The cops see the gun on the floor, and they notice that Jerry Lee is high out of his mind. And they ask him, were you going to shoot Elvis? Like, as they pulled him over, like, outside the gates, I guess, of Great, like, within enough proximity of Elvis's house that it was kind of implied that that's where he was headed. And Jerry Lee's version of the story is that when they said, were you going to shoot Elvis? And Jerry Lee's like, oh, yeah, sure, that's what I was going to do. Like, he seems to remember saying it sarcastically. That becomes an issue. Elvis doesn't press charges. He doesn't get, like, into too much trouble over this deal. But, like, everybody else's version of the story is a drunk, coked up, probably pilled up Jerry Lee pulls up in front of Graceland with a pistol and is screaming at Elvis about, come on out and we'll see who the king is. And that's why the cops got called, which makes a little bit more sense to me. The dude that already shot a guy on accident is outside your house screaming at you. And this is prime. Elvis is at his peak. Jerry Lee is at the bottom, despite they're both very similar acts with very similar styles and very like the two, like Jerry Lee is just a blonde version of Elvis, basically, except his reputation's in the dirt. So he's very jealous of what Elvis Presley has going on. And so I'm inclined to believe more that he's outside screaming about that. Like, that's what I think is probably more likely. But anyway, so also his marriage to Myra falls apart after 13 years or something. So, at that point, she'd been married to Jerry Lee for half her life. And she had enough of the drinking and the booze and everything else, and the, drugs and Jerry Lee seems to have, there's some credible accounts, kind of an abusive dude, like physically and verbally, and like not a good dude to be around. And so she decides she's had enough. She pulls her chute. They get divorced. Okay. So tragedy has started to hunt Jerry Lee Lewis pretty early in his career here. So the first big thing that happened was in 1962. His 3-year-old son, Steve Allen, drowns in a swimming pool. Now, and this is like, obviously soon after the fact, like this is right after his career hits the skids because everyone finds out that he's married to his 13-year-old cousin. A couple of years later, their son drowns in a swimming pool. So hit after hit after hit keeps coming for Jerry Lee here. And so that's the first tragedy. Then, come forward in the timeline, him and Myra get divorced. He gets remarried relatively quick to Jaron Pate. Now, this is the first. Oh, by the way, something you should know is that Jerry Lee's nickname for his entire life is the Killer. Everyone called him the Killer. Now, there's a few versions of that, of why he got that name. The first of which people will say that it came from his mom because she used to tell him, "Oh, go kill it on stage," and he's killing up there, kind of thing, and that's how he got the name the Killer. Other people say that it's because he's in a fight in high school, he's almost strangled a kid to death. Other people say it's from, some other. There is a rumor that Jerry Lee killed a guy, but it's not, I can't find that substantiated anywhere. So anyway, he's got this nickname though, and this reputation, and he's the guy that shot his bass player in the chest and is like, waving guns around outside Elvis's house. So everybody knows that this is not some like, pillar of moral virtue over here. And so he gets married to Jaron Pate, and their marriage goes south pretty quick. And she's, with his drug use and drinking and his abusive tendencies and everything else. Anyway, she ends up drowning in a swimming pool in 1971. So at the time, Jerry Lee was on the road, but already people were like suspicious of him and like, why, like, how did you affect this? And how was, like, people kind of thought it was Jerry Lee's fault in some way, even though, he was in a different state or whatever at the time. So that one wasn't Jerry Lee's direct fault necessarily. But then in 1973, he gets married to Shawn Stevens. That marriage is toxic and explosive from the jump. They're both on drugs, they're both alcoholics, and they have just a wild, toxic, conflict-filled marriage. And it only lasts 77 days before she dies from a drug overdose. Now, that one was a little harder for Jerry Lee to shake off because he was investigated as a suspect in her death, because she wasn't just OD'd, she had like bruises and cuts all over her body from... Now, the resulting investigation said that Jerry Lee likely did not have anything to do directly with her death. However, they had clearly been in a physically abusive relationship for a long time. Like, he had been beating the crap out of this lady for a while leading up to her drug overdose. So while there wasn't enough evidence to convict him of killing her, and she's obviously unable to, be a witness in her own abuse trial, so they couldn't do anything about it. So Jerry Lee gets off scot-free with that part of the deal, and very possibly gets off for murder. Like, that's a real possibility that could have happened here. And I mean, judging by everything else I've seen so far, that's kind of where I think that went. But like I said, allegedly, because in court he was declared not guilty of, being involved. But anyway, so that really does like put a kind of crescendo on the career of Jerry Lee Lewis here. Because I mean, he makes kind of a career comeback later when he gets into country music. For whatever reason, country music was way more willing to put up with Jerry Lee Lewis than rock and roll was. And so he does start to get some, success going again towards the later half, or the later, part of his life and career here. But in 1979, he gets audited by the IRS, and they basically said he owed like $3 million or something, which that turned out to be a little bit of he ended up paying like $600,000 because the rest of it was supposed to just be like interest and fees or something. So he doesn't have to pay the $3 million. He wins a court battle, but he does have to pay off, $600,000 or whatever. He gets married again, but that only so he gets married in 1983, and that one lasts until 2005. So pretty good stretch for Jerry Lee Lewis on the marriage front. And he gets inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame here. 1986. So Jerry Lee Lewis is in the inaugural class. It was like the first year of Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Jerry Lee Lewis is in there. And for his, contributions to music. And let's see here. And then he starts to get, that does kind of bring him back into the market and back into the spotlight. So he keeps getting, his record sales go up a little bit. He starts doing collaborations with people. His country stuff starts to do really well. And so now he's touring again and he's making money again. And that's, things start to go pretty well for him. But he does, like I said, he gets divorced in 2005. Again, and then he marries wife number 7, I believe, is Judith Brown. They get married in 2012, and they stay married until he dies in 2022. So that's 7 marriages and a wild life and career leading up to that point. They made a movie about his life called Great Balls of Fire that I think Dennis Quaid was starred in, but. Anyway, that's pretty much the end of the line for Jerry Lee Lewis here. The back half of his career is kind of like, everybody kind of acts like, oh, he's a legend, like, oh, he's, and to be fair to Jerry Lee Lewis, if he gets behind a piano, he's insane to watch. He's a wildly talented piano player and showman. I mean, you can't knock the dude's showmanship for sure. And so he has that reputation, so everybody talks about him like, oh yeah, Jerry Lee, he's a legend, blah, blah. But people kind of forget that, like, his struggles were well earned, that he sank his career in the beginning by marrying his 13-year-old cousin. He was an abusive alcoholic for a lot of his life. And then, also hunted by tragedy and, just terrible things happening all around him that he had nothing to do with. but ending up being a guy that, when he retired at one point there, he was just like, he had an 80-acre farm, I think, in Louisiana. I could be wrong about that. But it was just like, he just liked to hang out at his house, and he would charge people $15 if they wanted to come do the Jerry Lee Lewis farm tour. And he would do, he just walk people around, show them his life for $15 a pop. And he did that, for years. Anyway, and then he obviously slows down in the later, years here, and he'd show up for a performance here and there. But anyway, in 2022, he gets pneumonia and dies. So that's that's old Jerry Lee Lewis for us. And I didn't want to like harp on the guy too hard, but I'm also like, it's important because I think that his story intersects with some of our other characters, and he's going to intersect with other characters that we're going to do in the future. But yeah, I was a little conflicted on doing the Jerry Lee Lewis episode, because it's like, on the one hand, you don't want to just trash people that are dead for, no reason. But on the other hand, if you're telling the story of music history, you got to tell the whole thing. And he's a part of it with, warts and all. Jerry Lee Lewis is a big part of, American music, and the sound that you hear today. He's a big part of that story. So I felt like, we got to do it. So that's Jerry Lee Lewis. So thank y'all for listening, and we'll see you next week.